It's an important day for EU parliamentarian Jan Philipp Albrecht. He's been assured that he can take a look at the new confidential negotiation documents for the Transatlantic TTIP trade agreement. They're behind this door in a high-security room, safe from the public gaze and off-limits for most parliamentarians. First, Albrecht has to undergo a security check. We have to stay outside. They seem to be nervous about a TV crew being present. Security personnel show up often. And then a surprise statement.
I
wasn't able to see the latest documents following the last round of talks because Parliament, or those in charge here, don't consider me entitled to see them. Although I always had right of access after the last talks in my capacity as member of the Interior and Judiciary Committee, that right no longer seems to apply.
Does
the EU have something to hide? The Commission, perhaps?
The EU Commission certainly does not want all its comments concerning the TTIP negotiations to be made public immediately.
The good old EU, the wicked USA? That was a common notion here in Europe, perhaps. But now it's the EU that stands accused of undermining certain US standards. The EU wants less regulation for banks. We get to see several documents marked confidential and restricted for internal use only. The documents show that the EU is backing the interests of its banks in a big way. We show the paper to somebody from Finance Watch, which in principle isn't opposed to TTIP.
Here there's a mention that no legislation should be introduced that influences market participants in doing their business. It's this infamous wording that the legislation should not be any more burdensome than necessary. So for us, this really is a very questionable step towards further liberalization, especially in the area of financial markets.
Could it be that the EU, of all institutions, wants to let the banks off the leash where regulating them is concerned? The EU is opposed to the stricter US stipulations. The US demands that large foreign banks meet higher standards if their annual turnover amounts to more than 43 billion euros. Here in the US, we meet former US Secretary of Commerce Mickey Cantor. He supports the strict US regulation of banks and is critical of the EU.
I think it's important that the Europeans come up to the US standard. The US doesn't hold the standard in other areas, and we need to come up to the European standards, environment, food safety, and so on. On the other hand, I believe it'd be helpful if the Europeans would agree to raise their standards in their banking system.
What's known as the Dodd-Frank Act was introduced in the US after the 2007 financial crisis. Its aims are to increase consumer protection, enforce more transparency in securities trading, work towards establishing a monitoring system for the finance market, demand increased control of major banks, and require banks to increase reserve funds. We asked Michael Kemmer, head of the German Banking Association, how the Dodd-Act would affect European banks.
We still have certain differences between Europe and the US. Ironing out these differences and getting rid of them where possible would be very good, because it would also limit access hurdles for the banks in the other country.
But you would prefer the European regulations.
I'm not a total fan of the US rules because they have certain aspects that don't really fit in with the way the present European banking system works.
The banking associations seem to have exerted influence on the TTIP negotiations. We find further documents. Britain's The City UK Banking Association says the proposal by the EU Commission is so close to its own proposals, it could be straight out of its TTIP brochure. The EU member states agree just how important it is to have large international banks. Further confidential documents we were able to see show how they pursue this aim during TTIP negotiations. The member states even exert pressure on the EU Commission and demand tough negotiations in financial services and that they don't prematurely throw in the towel. Concerns regarding the influence of European banks on TTIP are growing. The director of the world's largest consumer protection organization in Washington shares these fears.
It's a push-down agreement. It's to push down the higher standards on either side of the Atlantic. So European food standards, European consumer privacy standards, U.S. financial regulations, that's the goal. And so if that's the goal and that's the engine, the kind of agreement the consumer groups on either side of the Atlantic want is not on the table, unfortunately.
But that would be fatal for the financial market. The last bank crash brought the world economy dangerously near to total collapse.